Important conversation. So, speaking of important conversation, Gospel of Mark, 10th chapter, verse 32 today, following up on that story that we've looked at the last couple days with Jesus and the rich man, the conversation following. And as we're going to see now, we're very close. In fact, we're less than a chapter from Jesus turning his face and sort of Mark turning the narrative toward Jerusalem. And we're going to see these kind of moments where Mark inserts stories that point toward the conclusion of the gospel. And so we start that here today, verse 32. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again, and he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." You can imagine that in the context of a conversation like this, the disciples don't know what to say. This is the most explicit that Jesus has been about his fate. He now mentions the Gentiles. That's code for Roman government in this instance. And that he not only will be put to death, but that he will be mistreated, that he will be ridiculed and reviled. And I think maybe in keeping with what they must have, what their reaction must have been, Mark just leaves it hanging there for the reader. There's really nothing that he follows up with. It simply comes almost out of nowhere, and it lands heavy.
Yeah, I think we should really not rush by what's happening here. Geographically, when we're told that he's on the road going up to Jerusalem, that's both supposed to give us context. It's supposed to move the story forward. We know where he's going. But this is also a marked change here in Mark's telling. Jesus is now putting his attention towards the capital, the center, the city of David, the place where all of the rising action is going to happen. And so as Jesus is walking ahead towards this city, he's not just going to a new location where he's going to preach, where he's going to be doing miracles. He's actually setting up the end of his story. And we know that because of what Jesus says to the disciples. This isn't on accident, it's intentional. And this connects to the stories that we have been reading. If you remember yesterday, we were talking about how the disciples were sort of trying to tease out, what's the outcome of us sacrificing all of this for the gospel? Don't we get included in this thing? And here Jesus is saying, ultimately, I'm going to be giving up absolutely everything. Jesus is setting the sort of bar of expectation that what is about to happen is going to be the complete self-emptying, as Paul says in Philippians. It's going to be this complete outpouring of himself for others. And it's not going to be on accident. It's not going to be a surprise. Jesus is saying, I just want you to know ahead of time, this is what is going to happen, and this is what it's going to mean.
And Mark continues a pattern we've seen here, which is that every time Jesus tries to give some illumination to what is about to happen, it's followed up with a story about the disciples not getting it. So when Peter calls him the Messiah, and then Jesus has to rebuke him when they go up the mountain, and then they come back down, and he's frustrated with the disciples. And it happens again here. Verse 35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said, "What is it you want me to do?" And they said, "Grant us to sit one on your right hand and one at your left in your glory." And Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with?" And they said, "We are able." And Jesus said, "The cup I drink, you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those whom it has been prepared." So in the midst of this conversation, Jesus has blessed the little children. He's criticized the rich man, or at least he has made a critique of the place of wealth. He said the first will be last, the last will be first. To be great, you have to be least. And James and John, who don't get it at all, come to him and say, Teacher, when you get to glory, and it's unlikely that they have the resurrection in mind here. They're probably still thinking Jesus is going to rule, that he's going to Jerusalem, he's going to seize power, and he's going to put himself on some kind of throne. And they're saying to him, we want to be right and left. We want to be first and second in your, what in our context we might call administration, in your court. And Jesus asked them this question, can you be baptized with my baptism? Can you drink the cup? And we know as readers, because we've seen the whole story, that he means the cross. He means suffering. He means, can you be faithful in the midst of persecution and oppression and even on the brink of death? And they say, sure, we are able. And rather than scold them, Jesus says, yeah, I tell you the truth, you will. And probably this is a reference to James and John future life, what they're going to eventually live into as they become disciples after Easter. But then Jesus says, sitting on my right or left, that's not mine to grant, but for those who've been prepared. And I find this interesting, Michael, that we would expect maybe a rebuke here. When James and John make this fairly grandiose request, we might expect Jesus to chew them out a little bit, as we've seen in other parts of the story. And here, he almost, it reads kind of sympathetic, kind of compassionate, and Jesus really diffuses this situation, I think, in a way that I'm not sure we've seen in the same way so far in the story.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts, but I think let's finish the story here and we can sort of look back over it, Clint. So let's maybe verse 41.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so when they heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So Jesus turns this into a teaching moment, and what I think is really fascinating about it is how Mark has layered multiple different senses of meaning into this story. We see something on the other side of this story than what the disciples may have seen. Let me explain what I mean by that. A little bit before here, you don't know what you're asking, to drink the cup that I drink or be baptism with the baptism that I'm baptized with. We are tempted on this side of Jesus' life, death, resurrection to see that cup and to think the Lord's Supper, to think of that upper room where Jesus is teaching this practice that we still continue to do in worship. We also tend to think of baptism as that thing that we continue on as well. But the disciples, when they heard this the first time, likely would have not thought of that. It hadn't happened yet. They would think of the cup that the ruler shares. It's a symbol of power, prestige, authority. In fact, the one who's the cup bearer has a privileged place in the ruler's court. So the disciples who were just asking Jesus, who's the person in authority, likely hear Jesus saying that they get to be the ones who are close to the cup, this symbol of authority. When Jesus says, can you be baptized with my baptism? They're likely thinking of John, who's doing this baptism, this idea of asceticism and spiritual commitment, this idea that Jesus is calling them to be above and beyond the baptism of others, the spiritual discipleship of others. And if that's what they thought, what happens next is even more astounding because, like you said, Clint, Jesus doesn't berate. In other places in Mark, Jesus doesn't really chew the disciples out. He sort of gets flustered. He sort of throws his hands up and says, you just don't get it. But here, he points out how the power of the Gentiles is such that it abuses the freedom and humanity of others. And he says that not so in his kingdom. In his kingdom, that the great must be the servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the slave. And he then ends with this powerful statement, for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. And so we see Jesus once again, as he does so often, turn the disciples' expectations on its head. And in this case, Clint, he turns it into a masterclass of Christian leadership, which is much easier to say than do.
One of the things that I think Mark may be doing, it's hard to know if it's intentional because it is so well done and it is fairly subtle. But I think, Michael, you pointed out. So as we move through the gospel here, really, in many ways, the focus is going to be less on people not getting it and more on the reality of what is ahead of Jesus, more on the reality of what Jesus' mission is going to be. And then we are going to end with this giant question mark, do they get it or not? And it is as if Mark is using every tool at his disposal to bring our focus more and more narrowly to the cross. And we, at this point in the text, don't know that he's doing that yet. But instead of Jesus here scolding the disciples, he's going to give them a lesson on what it means to follow Jesus versus what it means to be in the world. How they are different because they're his disciples, how they are to live differently, how they're to treat one another differently, and how that's at odds with the world around them. And we're going to see, I think we're going to see more instances of that as we move forward. And it's very, it's not a thing you would necessarily pick up just from reading the gospel, but I do think it is masterfully crafted to continue to move our attention where Mark wants it to be.
And if you want to keep going down the road with that analogy, Clint, as we begin to see the focus more and more draw in on Jesus Christ, a thing that does surprisingly is it reveals the expansiveness of Jesus's power and authority and mission. That's a thing that is not really intuitive to us. The idea that as we focus in on one very finite, specific thing, we would think that we would just sort of become locked in Jesus and his agenda, what he has to say. But that's not true. Jesus has this really world-changing way of when things get honed in and dialed in on who he is, he points and shows us a way far greater and grander than we thought possible. As the disciples are fighting over the right and the left, what are the two spots that we can get, Jesus? Jesus is saying, no. No, there's a spot for everybody who's willing to serve. Everyone who's willing to be least, there's a spot waiting for them. You don't have to pick right or left. And as you get closer to Jesus, you begin to see that the reason why Jesus is so difficult to pin down, the reason why the Pharisees can't get him on one side and the disciples don't seem to understand him on the other, is because Jesus's vision is always beyond the sort of self-centered human impulse. He's always thinking about his mission to serve others. He's using his position of power and authority as the Son of God for the sake of others. He's never abusing it to his own end. And because of that radically world-shaping difference, Jesus, as we get closer to the heart of who he is and his mission in the world, we will become even more astounded by what he does and says.
I think that we often feel like Jesus is at odds with people, right? He argues with a Pharisee, he argues with a scribe, he maybe scuffles a little bit with the Roman government toward the end of the story. I think it's more difficult for us to conceive that Jesus is at odds with the world, the culture, that what Jesus brings to the disciples is an understanding that is upside down from the culture around them. And I understand culture is just people living out their lives, But I think it's easy to think that Jesus is crossways with individuals and miss the fact that Jesus is in some ways at odds with the entire system around him. And so what Jesus says here is you shouldn't, that to link greatness with service is revolutionary, literally revolutionary. For Jesus to say, okay, you think that being next to me, you can arrive at you want power, you want prestige, you want all of that. I'm telling you that's not what greatness is. I'm telling you that to be great is to serve, is to love, is to forgive. Those are all lessons that are down the road for us now. And I think in that sense, what Jesus says here can easily be missed, Michael, but it is profoundly important and amazingly deep.
We're going to pick this up, and so I'm not going to stay here, not going to linger here, but let it not pass by us that what Jesus is telling his disciples is that the way for the revolution of God's plan to work in the world will look like absolute failure. He's saying the way that God's going to win is through crucifixion, death, being handed over to the enemy, and them winning. And of course, we know that at the end, he says, and resurrected on the third day. Who knows what the disciples thought when they heard that? What Jesus is saying is the way of God's kingdom looks like, from the human vantage, as utter cultural failure. I think you say it so well, Clint. It's not just that Jesus is sparring with some Pharisees. Jesus is calling against the entire grain of the world in which he lives. And we miss the power of that because not only does Jesus teach this, but he lives it. And I don't just mean the service aspect. He lives it as he lives into the death that he predicts. And then God is shown to be all-powerful in the life that is lived beyond that death. And man, if you don't start to get excited in Mark at this point, I mean, you will, because from this point on, this book just gets a speed and a kind of, it's only going to pick up and get better.
I want to be careful as I characterize this, but as we read this last verse, for the Son of Man came not to be served, but serve, and to give his life for a ransom for many. There's a sense in which I think Jesus is saying, look, I'm not here to win. I'm here so that by losing, I can bring victory to everyone else. And we'd have to be very careful with words like win and lose there, because ultimately we know that Jesus is victorious. That's a win. But in keeping with these ideas here in this text, Jesus is essentially saying, look, I'm not looking for high and mighty. I'm not looking for a throne. I'm not gathering an army. I'm here to give myself for others. And if you want to be great, that's the path to the kind of greatness that I'm showing you. And it couldn't be simpler, and it couldn't be more difficult.
It's a good summary. We'll continue on tomorrow. We'll encounter blind Bartimaeus, and we hope that you can join us.
Yeah, stay warm, stay well, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally. But be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.